students, welcome back to CHRTC 309. So this is Sociology of Youth and Religion. So yeah, continuing with this week, all this week, we are talking about the religious landscape. So in this lecture, picking up kind of from where we left off last time, we're going to look at the religious landscape specifically in the United States, and kind of what that's looking like. So we're going to do some information from Pew, and then in following lectures, we're going to look at, further kind of information from Pew with kind of different studies that they did. Okay, so this is this nice little chart is courtesy of Ryan Burge, which I took off of Twitter or X. You can follow him at Ryan Burge, and if you're interested in kind of social religion, highly recommend him. A really interesting fellow political scientist, so he looks at things a little bit differently, but his work is honestly second to none, in my opinion. Okay, so what do we see here in terms of kind of disaffiliation by generation? And this is the U.S. This data taken from the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago. General Social Survey, which has been running from 2017 to the present. All right, this data taken from 1972 to 2018. And we see the same story, in the US as we see in Canada, right? The older the generation is, the lower the rates of disaffiliation. Now, obviously, what you have here is a scatter graph, right? So with all these dots representing data points along the way, right? So we've seen some kind of variances, in the data, but the trend, so I mean, like there's weird outliers here, right? Like, around, what would this be? Probably around 1980, 83, 84, you have, this one little orange dot, this one little orange dot right around here, that's way like the heck out there for high rates amongst Gen X of disaffiliation, right? They're above 20%, but everything else on the scatter graph is kind of lower than that, and they remain lower than that basically till the present, right? So we got a weird outlier piece of data. But you can kind of see Ryan doing the general trend lines, right? And for every generation, it's sort of up as in terms of disaffiliation overall, if you look at the kind of trend line. No, they're not perfect trend lines, right? They're maybe a little bit too generous, but the trend is pretty clear, right? The dots are kind of moving upwards for every generation, into higher rates of disaffiliation. Okay, so I mean, basically at the end of the general social survey, you got like, the silent generation, a little bit more than 10%, all right, here, saying that they are non-religious, religiously unaffiliated. The baby boomers higher than that, around 15, 16%. Gen X, sitting right around 20%. Gen Z, I'll talk about them in a minute. We have a single data point for Gen Z, so I wouldn't take this as too, I wouldn't take it too literally here. One of the things that's interesting here, right, Gen Z showing lower than millennials. When this is taken, right, there's a lot of really young Gen Zers that are just coming into adulthood. What you tend to see is people disaffiliating as they move, into their late teens, early 20s, and certainly into their later 20s. So Gen Z, we have the single data point. That's probably the first kind of measurement we have of Gen Z. It's a little bit lower, still high, like still way higher than Gen X, right? So, they're still above 25%, a quarter of them or more saying that they are religiously unaffiliated. But that's a single data point. I would expect that to trend up like the other ones have, right? Especially as we get more data points and as they get older, right? And you can see things like for the millennials, right? Like when we start to measure the millennials, that first kind of cohort that appeared for us, right around the end of the 1990s, right? The first ones who were measured as adults. It wasn't huge percent compared to what it'll be, right? Less than 25%, less than a quarter, and then it drops. So our first couple of measurements, kind of goes down, but then pretty steady rises in the numbers. And, today it sits at, more than a third or about a third. So, right, every generation is getting less religiously affiliated. That's what the religious landscape looks like. The trend lines are not perfect, but they're pretty clear. And I mean, I would expect Gen Z to sort of head in that direction as well. Maybe not at quite the line that I drew there, but as we get more data points, you're going to see it probably kind of ticking up as they get a little bit older, right? And as they move out of those who are religious, who might be like marginally religious, moving out of their parents' houses and away from parental influence, which again is going to probably lead at some point to disaffiliation. All right, so one of the other big categories that we use in sociology of religion to talk about religiosity, right? So how religious people are is basically behavior. So if we look at kind of the past slides, right? One of the things that we can say about those past slides is that we were talking about belonging, right? Who belongs to what religion? Like on a survey, they check what? Behavior is what they do, right? And probably, though it's not the only way we measure behavior, right? We would measure things like frequency of prayer. We would measure, frequency of interaction with sacred books. But church attendance or religious service attendance is one of the really major ways that we think about, how religious someone is, about religiosity. And what we can say, right, is that in Canada and the US, we see falling rates of weekly religious service attendance. So what's on the chart here is monthly, at least once a month, religious service attendance, right? And so almost half, right, of Americans in 2012 reported that they attended religious services at least once a month, and it was about a little over a quarter of Canadian. Now, both these numbers have gone down a little bit since then. That said, I will give a kind of like everything kind of looks stable, but I will give one big caveat, and this is that this is one of those numbers that I think most people who study the field suspect is probably really susceptible to a kind of self-reporting bias or a social desirability bias, wherein people feel like they should say they attend religious services more than they do. And I know there's one American commentator, I think he writes out of National Review, his name is Michael Brandon Doherty, and he says that the religious service attendance numbers have to be bollocks, absolute bananas. Why? Because he says, if nearly half of Americans were rushing to religious services on Sunday mornings, then Sunday mornings would be one of the busiest traffic times of the week, right? Like people would be rushing around all morning getting to religious services, and frankly, it's simply not. And I think there's something to this sort of observational pushback on some of these questions, right? That said, this is what people report, right? That they attend religious services about this frequently. I think the number in Canada as it stands in 2021 is about 21%. And in the US, it still sits in the 40s. So, still a fair number of people either attend religious services at least once a month or feel like they should do so. Okay, so very similar to the Canadian situation, the US situation. Basically, what we see, so these numbers are out of 2014, so they're almost a decade old at this point. But the story basically was pretty similar. Essentially, like evangelical Protestantism, if we split it off from mainline Protestantism, more or less holding kind of steady, right? Not a lot of losses in terms of population. And actually, if we actually just look at the raw numbers, they're growing. Just other parts of the U.S. population are growing a little bit more quickly. The unaffiliated, right, had gone from, in 2007, 16% of the population to 22%, or essentially, the single largest group after evangelical Protestants. Roman Catholics, a slight decline, 3.1% down to about 20%, so a fifth of Americans defining themselves as Roman Catholics. Mainline Protestants taking a hard drop of 3.4%. Pretty close to what the Catholic one is, so not hugely there, and non-Christian faiths kind of growing slowly. But we'll talk about, there's lots of kind of interesting things to go and look at. Mainline Protestants definitely, in terms of Christian groups, have been the ones that have taken the biggest beating, right? They've declined by far the fastest. The Catholics, again, not doing particularly well, I think, in the United States. The attrition rate, we'll talk about that when we get to the nuns. The NONESs, right? Not the NUNSs. NONES, or nothing in particular. Because, given the sources of U.S. immigration being principally Latin America, and Latin America itself being almost entirely Roman Catholic, there's a lot more Protestants there than there were in the past, but a lot of Roman Catholics in Latin America as well. What you should see, given how many people have been coming to the United States in the last few years, a big jump in Roman Catholics. Now, okay, there's a couple of possibilities here that we should think about. One is that because a lot of the immigration is undocumented or illegal, that the official numbers, right, taken in polls may not actually capture that. And that it actually may be really difficult to capture how many people have come to the United States, illegally, and therefore, maybe we're not capturing how many more Roman Catholics have shown up. I don't think that's entirely the case, but it's possible they just don't take phone polls and they're not, going to take internet polls either, given their kind of socioeconomic condition. Okay, that's a definite possibility. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, but we should see at least some effect at some point in terms of all these people who have come, from Latin America, increasing the number of Roman Catholics or the percentage of Roman Catholics in the United States. That said, if you look at the percentage of Roman Catholics, it is shifting to a more Hispanic, right? There's more Hispanic Catholics in the United States now than there ever were. And I do think that's very interesting. And certainly, white Catholics, particularly those of like Irish, Italian, and Polish kind of descent, that principally lived in the Northeast and Northeast Midwest, they are attriting out of the faith quite quickly. And so that's changing the face of the Roman Catholic Church in the United States. When we look at the attrition rates in the nuns, I think we'll talk about retention. Almost half, right? Almost half of Roman Catholics in their 20s and 30s, or people who were brought up Roman Catholic, report that they no longer consider themselves Catholic, right? So you're looking at roughly half of those raised in the religion who move out of it. Now, not everyone moves into nothing in particular. Some of them, as we'll see, move into other spaces as well. But we'll take a look at that when we talk about the nuns, because that's where I have that particular bit of information. For some statistics from within the church have suggested for every one person who comes in, right, so one person who converts to Catholicism, 6 leave. And this is not the sign necessarily of a healthy religion that's doing a really great job of keeping its own people. And if you want to, compare that to evangelicals, I don't have the 1 to 6 number there, but about 76% of those raised evangelicals remain evangelicals in adulthood in the U.S., and they recruit pretty strongly from other groups, including, those who consider themselves non-religious or nothing in particular. And so, then they recruit well from Roman Catholics and these sorts of things, right? Yeah, essentially, if ex-Catholics were counted as a religious denomination, and we basically took them out of the unaffiliated, and made them a different group, they would be the largest denomination of kind of religious people in the United States after Roman Catholicism itself. So there's a huge number. And we can say, and I will say later in the course as well, that clearly one of the things that's happening is Roman Catholics over-contribute. Based on their percentage of the population, they way over-contribute to the nuns. So let's put that on the back burner for the moment. Yeah, despite the Catholic population declining despite this influx is bad news. Evangelicals remaining roughly even, and this is one thing that Ryan Burge talks about in his 20 myths about American religion, is that there is so far, no evangelical decline to speak of. Now, it may be coming, and it probably is. The average age of evangelicals is creeping up there too, but it hasn't started yet. Okay, so slightly updated numbers here. This one taking us with the GSS data in the US all the way to 2018. And what you see, right, there's a dotted line, on the right side of the graphic. And that's where basically that's a projection, right? So that's like if current trend lines continue, this is what things should look like roughly around 2030. Okay, so what does it look like? And this again is the United States. Okay, so I mean, I think a couple of really interesting things to know, right? That so you've got this, this orange band, right? This orange band right here, kind of starting right here. That's your mainline Protestants, right? So those are your Methodists, your Anglicans, your Presbyterians, your Lutherans, and all of that fun stuff. And what you see is, very consistently with what I was talking about in Canada and what I've been mentioning so far, is the mainline Protestants, right? Kind of a high point for them. Nearly, 30% of them, or 30% of Americans were mainline Protestants, at least in one survey of the GSS, right about here, kind of towards, 1982, 83. Right? And from there, everything on the scatter plot is basically dropping like a stone, right? Again, you have a little bit of a high spot over in 1990, where it's about, 26, 27%. And then by the time you get down here to the lower part of the scatter plot, right, what you've got is, 10%, getting towards the early 2010s. And or the late 2010s rather, and by the time you're in 2018, that last point, you're maybe 12, 13% of the US population maximum. And that is a great big huge ugly decline for mainline Protestantism. And Ryan's projection, which again he'll admit openly when he's talking about this, that this projection is probably flawed because he thinks the declines are actually going to be faster. But if you just kind of follow the trend line, by 2030, amongst other things, there are going to be fewer mainline Protestants. Sorry, I lost my mouse as I'm working here. There are going to be fewer mainline Protestants than Black Protestants or other faith in the United States, and will basically have dropped below 5% of the population. For something that, topped out, in the 80s, with 28% of the population, that's not particularly impressive, right? Okay. The other big trend line that I think is worth noting here is the one that starts right about here, right? Pretty low. I guess the lowest part on the scatter plot is here, or the first part of the scatter plot is right here. Probably about 7-8%. Is our nothing in particulars, right? Our no religion. And obviously, right, there's a lot of discrepancy in the data. It kind of stays around the 7-8% range. Its lowest kind of probably about 6, right about here. But after that, we see pretty steady growth. By 2000, you're talking pretty close to, these points, 13 to 15, 13, 14, maybe even as high as 15%. By 2000. By 2010, right, our points are a little bit more scattered, but we have a good point here, just below 20, right, maybe 18%. And then by, all rising there, so above our trend line, to sitting above kind of the Roman Catholic number right here, and just below the evangelical number. Okay, so a steady rise in our nothing in particular, no religion, from basically humble origins in the 1980s to much less humble today. And, Ryan's projection puts it as the biggest grouping in America, essentially by the year 2030. It'll be getting close to 30% of the entire population, whereas as he projects Catholics and evangelicals to decline, again, he figures it's going to be bigger than that. And this gray zone shows, the possible range that he thinks they could be in. Okay. I'm giving you lots of details on the religious landscape here. All good, I hope. Maybe not. Evangelicals, right? Pretty steady as she goes. You've got your evangelicals just a little bit above Roman Catholics. They hit their high point right here, right here in, probably about 1993, if I'm guessing, if I remember the statistics correctly. In 1993, they hit about 30% of the U.S. population. That's a high, a very religious moment for whatever in the early 1990s, right? Everybody had a kind of a bump there, and from there, kind of steady decline overall, right? Down, 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 over time, and coming below Roman Catholics, he thinks by I'm probably like the rough trend line. Again, there's ranges here. But below Roman Catholics, by 2030. So that's sort of what he thinks about evangelicals. And like I said, really high point at 30% in about 1993, which is interesting. And then obviously still a lot of range, right? Bumping down at about 25%, being pretty close to the lowest. I guess what is kind of interesting, right, is like, they start out, and here's something, Ryan, I'll say, the percentage probably hasn't changed that much, roughly, right? So they kind of start out here, which is an interesting kind of thing. And that's, kind of 24%. And then bump up, they take a big jump, kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, up to about 30%. And then kind of trundle their way down. And we're seeing right there, they're about the same spot as they were at the beginning. Same thing there. Again, another little jump. And then these final two data points are basically sort of where evangelicalism has always been. So I think that's really interesting, right? Evangelicalism as a part of American society bumps up and down, but it seems to be kind of stable, right? As a percentage of the population, it is in 2018 roughly where it was in 1980. There's not a huge difference or a huge change, except that it had this kind of volcanic growth up to about 30% of the U.S. population in the 1990s for, trending towards the 1990s. A measurement error maybe, but, that one was way outside kind of the standard deviation. But, there nonetheless. Okay. I know you can all read scatter plots, but I'm sort of narrating them as I go to give you a sense of the religious landscape here. All right, our last one. We'll pick we'll see if I can grab some Teely right here for a pen, right? Our Roman Catholics. Again, our kind of high points for Roman Catholics aren't as high, right? Probably about here in the 1980s. And Catholics have kind of trended, and the clusters are a lot tighter. Lowest probably going to be in right there, but Catholics kind of on the same trend line, above evangelicals, maybe by 2030, the lines kind of flip. So, that's pretty much the story. I think what I think is probably the most interesting here, and I maybe should have led with this on this slide, is the almost inverse growth, and I think this matters. The inverse correlation between the main line and nothing in particular, right? As the main line has dropped, nothing in particular has risen almost by the same percentage, right? So this has led some people to conclude, and I think there's a lot to this, that the principal factor that's driven the growth of no religion in America has been the collapse of mainline Protestantism. Right, with some contribution from Roman Catholics and evangelicals, who've certainly lost people, but much bigger contribution from the Protestant mainline, which has just absolutely free-falled. Okay, so I do want to stress something here that I do think is kind of important, right? Just because people are, potentially no longer identifying as Christian, it doesn't mean that they are atheist, and it does not mean that they are agnostic either. So what do I mean here? Right? There is this category, and we're going to talk a lot about this because we're going to look at the nuns in detail in one of the coming lectures. Nothing in particular, right? When it comes to religious beliefs, nothing in particular is the one that's seen the most dramatic gains. Atheists and agnostics, right, have seen relatively modest gains, right? 1.5%, you know, 1.5% versus, nothing in particular, which has seen fundamentally the most growth. Now, there is a distinction between these things and there is not, right? Like atheists and agnostics will put forward specific kinds of beliefs, right? They will tell you in some sense what they believe on these particular points. So, nothing in particular often is just kind of indifference, right? A lot of it is sort of religious indifference. There's some spiritual beliefs in there, and we'll talk about that. But for the most part, it's a sort of kind of religious indifference. Like, they don't care enough to even be atheists or agnostics. It's not entirely clear what this is. It's not entirely clear what this means for, say, the Canadian or American religious landscape because they are nothing in particular, right? It's just a sort of religious indifference. Is that something that's permanent? Is it something that can be reversed, right? Is it something that will be reversed? Are they open to religion or not? It's just not clear, right? Okay. These might also be, and there's been a lot of contention, and I'll talk about his argument in The Myth of the Dying Church in a little bit here from Glenn Stanton, that these might just be marginal Christians, people who were sort of marginally attached, who were never really strongly affiliated, and frankly, they may not have attended religious services or prayed or done any of those things very often, but because everybody had a religion, they did too. And now with that social pressure, they've just kind of said, okay, well, I don't need to be anything, so I'm not. So anyway, we'll explore that in detail as we go here. Okay, so I think here we can also talk about kind of changing religious ideas, right? Changing kind of understandings of religion in lots of interesting ways. Okay, so if we look at, religious behaviors, right? And, belonging, belief, and importance are all things that are being measured here. And these numbers out of 2014 and Pew's Religious Landscape Survey. So one of the things that we can definitely say is that, daily prayer clearly kind of on a downward trajectory across these generational cohorts, right? Each cohort essentially prays daily less than the last, with the younger millennials, around 90 to 96, doing so the least. So those are all down. Religious service attendance, again, the highest salience in those older, the silent generation. Big decline for the boomers, not much of a decline there for Gen X. Older millennials, a decent decline, I think. And then not much difference between older millennials and young millennials, right? And I think that's pretty consistent, but downwards altogether. These ones are, I think, kind of interesting, all in, I think, a downward trend. But what's interesting is, like for this, belief in God, everything remains well into majority territory, right? Everybody still believes in God, well, not everybody, right? But vast majorities of the population, like 92%, 92%, 89%, a drop from there of 5%, for older millennials, and of 4% for younger millennials, but still, those are all in way majority territory. With absolute certainty, this is the stupidest question in the world. By the way, I hate this question. I wish they wouldn't ask it because it's really, really dumb. Because I know Catholic priests who are like, well, with absolute certainty, that's a pretty high standard. Okay, but again, decreases, right? How many silence believe in God with absolute certainty? 71%. Not a decline for the boomers, most of them do. A little bit of a decline for Gen Z, and we're barely in majority territory. Now, absolute certainty, I think, is too high a standard anyway. I think this is a silly question because, that's like saying, do you have no doubts? And I think, I don't think that's a reasonable kind of question. Most people have some doubts, right? Believe in heaven. Again, we're in majority territory across the board. A decline, but, ever so slight. Believe Scripture is the Word of God. I'm actually surprised with this one. We're still in majority territory, even amongst our youngest cohorts, barely so. But, it's a decline, but one that's still in majority territory. Belief in hell, pretty consistent across the generations, actually. About half, a little more than half all the way across, right? Only a 1% difference between the silents and younger millennials. So, no real decline there, even though, these are, they 20% fewer believe in God, less shared that believed in hell. So there are clearly people who, anyway, you get the idea. Religious salience, though, I think obviously here we see a big difference and a huge decline, essentially a 30% decline from our silent generation, who, two-thirds of them, sorry, two-thirds, not three-quarters, two-thirds, thought religion was very important in their lives versus, 30% less in terms of younger millennials that say so. And, after Gen X, we get into minority territory. Less than half say religion is very important in their lives. So clearly, religious salience kind of falls off very strongly with both older and younger millennials, which I do think, again, is very interesting. Again, lots of really interesting information on this chart. Right, so, half of nuns who left childhood faith over lack of belief, 1 in 5 cite a dislike of organized religion. So reason for disaffiliation among those who were raised in a religion and are currently one of these things, right? So as a net, right, 49% of those who basically became a nun, who left childhood religion, 49% of them said they don't believe, right? And that's 82% of atheists, obviously. Actually surprised it's not higher. And 63% of agnostics. Only 37% of nothing in particular, right? And this is a really interesting number. Only 37% of nothing in particulars say they left childhood religion because they don't believe. Interesting. Disenchanted, don't believe. 36% overall, again, highest for atheists. Agnostics, not even in majority territory. Only a quarter of nothing in particular. So nuns are something different. Not interested in religion, right? Here, atheists, they didn't leave because they're not interested. Only 3% basically, and 8%, 7%. Nothing too. Views evolved, right? Again, 7% overall. Most people don't cite a views evolution. And a very small number of them, say they went through a crisis of faith. It's like 2-1, 2-1, really not a significant number. Disliking organized religion, actually fewer atheists apparently said they left because they dislike organized religion. A lot of our nuns, right, a fifth, said they disliked organized religion, so that's interesting. Anti-institutional religion, they don't like institutional religion. Religion focused on power politics, that's not a big number. I think that number would go up after Trump, but whatever. I don't have those numbers handy. Religiously unsure or undecided, unaffiliated but religious, right? So that's 10% of our nuns. Obviously not our atheist agnostic. Open-minded, seeking open-minded. So still 7% of them say they're open-minded. Only 3% say they're spiritual but not religious. So a lot are unaffiliated but religious, which is a weird number. Right? Like religious in what sense? But okay, these might be Christians who are non-denominational too. They could be lumped in there. Inactive believer, right? So this is obviously 10% overall, 0 atheists, 3 agnostics, 14% of nothing in particular say they're a believer, they're just inactive, right? 11% are non-practicing but would still identify. 3% say they're too busy, right? So that I think is really, really interesting. Overall, right? So we see like the nothing in particular, the numbers are a very mixed bag here, right? It's like only a third of them don't believe, only 25% of them were disenchanted. Some just aren't religious because they dislike institutional religious. Some are religious but unaffiliated, right? A really kind of mixed bag, just altogether very messy.